Good afternoon. My name is Trey Dimsdale. I'm the Director of Program Outreach at the Acton Institute. And I am honored to welcome you all here to the Mark Murray Auditorium in the Acton Building for the last Acton Lecture Series lunch of 2018. I want to extend a special thank you to the benefactors who've been able to make this possible. Nothing that the Acton Institute does would be possible without the generosity of those who believe in our mission and are willing to partner with us to make things like this happen. Please be aware that we are recording today's event. We've begun live streaming all of these events and the other things that happen in our building. So be aware of that as the lecture's going on, but then also during the Q&A portion of today's program, there'll be two Acton staff members who'll have microphones. They'll come to you for you to be able to ask questions, but we ask that you wait until you get the microphone to make sure that the questions are clear, both in the recording and for those who would be joining us remotely. We also have two books at the back of the auditorium for sale that were authored by by today's speaker, and he'd be more than happy to sign those books. They are The System Has a Soul and The End of Secularism, and those are both available for sale at a discount if you're interested in purchasing them today. But it's my privilege to welcome my friend and my colleague, Dr. Hunter Baker, who is an affiliate scholar with the Acton Institute, but his day job is that he's the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. He's the author of these two books that we have for sale, in addition to The Political Thought, A Student's Guide. He's also written widely for a variety of outlets, which include Touchstone, Christianity Today, Modern Age, Public Discourse, the Journal of Law and Religion, Perspective in Politics. Dr. Baker won the Acton Institute's Michael Novak Award in 2011 and now also serves as an associate editor of our Journal of Markets and Morality. He's also a research fellow for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Dr. Baker, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. You know, in the age of Netflix, it's not that easy to get people to come out and listen to a public lecture, so I appreciate that. And you know, I think I also heard, did I hear that people are here, students from the Potter's House? Is that what I heard from a school? Yes. So glad to see you. May have some future politicians. These remarks are somewhat addressed to people who might be politicians someday, so I'm happy to have a chance to speak with you. This piano is kind of tempting me. I kind of almost want to drift over there and do Strangers in the Night or something. But instead, we're going to talk about Christian statesmanship. I want to start by talking about gratitude and patriotism a little bit as I work my way toward talking about statesmanship. Now, I live in Jackson, Tennessee, between the two rivers, Tennessee River and the Mississippi River. And we have a park in town called Liberty Park and Arboretum. And this park, it was actually some time before I took the opportunity to sort of read the monuments and the things in the park, and I figured out this is actually a park that was built in response to 9/11, 2001, and those, sort of a living memorial after those devastating attacks. And the events surrounding that day are still vivid. I'm sure that all of us who are old enough remember it very well. And I'll never forget, it wasn't long after that I had a flight out of the Atlanta airport. And if you've ever been to the Atlanta airport, you try to imagine that place silent, right? Silent and with lots of soldiers with M16s standing around. And I also went to Washington, D.C. not long after. And I remember trying to get to my destination. And there was, trying to follow a GPS on the rental car. And I looked up, and all of a sudden there was the Pentagon, but smashed, right? With a giant giant smashed area where a jumbo jet had been flown into it. It was really as if my country was on its back. One of the interesting things about people is the way they tend to unite in the wake of tragedies like that. I also remember living through, really for the first time as a father with wife and children, through a very intense hurricane in Houston. You know, it's probably about a decade or so ago. Tough night, couldn't sleep at all because of the sound of the storm just raging outside. And when the dawn finally arrived, I opened the door and looked out, and the wreck of our neighborhood was evident. The homes, by and large still stood. Roof shingles were everywhere. Large trees had been sheared and shredded. Some roads were blocked, fences laid flat or hung at odd angles. We lost power that wouldn't turn on for several days. But counterintuitively, it's often negative events like that that bring out the best in people. We got together, all of us, we had rapidly thawing meat in our refrigerators and freezers that were no longer working. And we got together with our neighbors, in a way that we normally didn't, to share a meal. There was one, normally kind of quiet guy on the street, kept to himself, and after the storm, he kind of came alive in the face of the adversity. It was as though he gained a sense of purpose from the events that occurred, and it was like this guy suddenly became the mayor of our block, right? So the period immediately following September 11 was kind of like that. People banded together. They felt a sense of solidarity with each other that they normally didn't seem to. I remember going to Pensacola to meet with my mother and sister for a short trip, and as I passed Seville Square, kind of a historic area, I saw the setup for sort of an impromptu patriotic rally. I could see some of the signs, a very good-hearted, positive affair, celebrating the things that we love about our country. And it surprised me, right? We have our holidays, our Veterans Day, our July 4th, but you don't see things like that. And at the same time, if you were to look back, social scientists note that there was a surge in church attendance during this same period. But as we all know, because we live in the world today, these changes proved to be temporary. Tragedy and loss remind us of the things we treasure, but such recoveries tend to be brief. And I fear that we spend far more of our time forgetting the things that we love rather than being grateful for them and taking care to protect them. So despite the brevity of the reign of those moments, right, those moments that led to the establishment of Liberty Garden Park in Jackson, Tennessee, I can still go to the park and I can examine what the people who put it together were thinking about. And I think that great care went into the selection of the documents, the things that would be memorialized in that park. Most people just walk around the park and they do laps and they never notice any of it, but I suddenly kind of became aware. So what did I see there? What kind of memorials were chosen? What are we grateful for? So as I passed through the collection of the park, looking at the things that were there, I reflected upon Washington's courage, humility, and restraint. Byron wrote of him, the first, the last, the best, the Cincinnatus of the West. Jefferson's brilliance, Lincoln's endurance and ambition, the Bill of Rights, the post-Civil War constitutional amendments that sought to more fully vindicate America's ideals, Susan B. Anthony's long crusade for the vote, Martin Luther King Jr.'s prophetic appeal for America to live up to its promise of recognizing God-given rights in all men, and triumph in wars during the bloodiest century of mankind's existence, the 20th century. Glory, disappointment, tragedies, and exceptional achievement. All of these are part of our story. Now, the reason I've worked to describe this inheritance as Americans is with the aim of demonstrating that we have something worth preserving together. We share something that is good in our country, and we recognize our blessings, but often all too briefly in those moments of clarity that crisis can bring. Now, the memorial at Liberty Garden says, "It is dedicated to those who gave their lives to preserve us a free nation." And we have been preserved in our freedom, but the American founders were only too well aware that a free people must also be a virtuous people. Freedom without virtue ultimately leads to chaos, disorder, enmity, and the nightmare of a populace where everyone has rights and no one has responsibilities. If we want to maintain self-government as a society, then we must govern ourselves, our passions, our reactions to disappointments, and even our sense of triumph. Study after study shows that polarization and division are growing both in our government and in our society. I'm involved with a civic organization called Better Angels, named after the quote that Lincoln made, "The better angels of our nature." And that group sums up the situation well. They note the existence of three concerning divisions in our society. First, a large and growing partisan divide. Americans increasingly believe that those with whom they disagree politically are not only misguided, but are objectively bad people, members of an alien outgroup. There's a large and growing class divide. The approximately 30% of Americans with four-year college degrees are mostly thriving, while the other 70% have been falling further and further behind over the long term. A large and growing governing divide. Huge numbers of Americans no longer believe that their elected leaders, including those from their own party, are honest or can be trusted even to try to do the right thing. Now, what are the causes of these growing rifts? We live in a time of unprecedented technological and cultural change. In our country today, almost every human being has the ability to contact or to interact with almost every other human being. And the great majority of us have access to more information than was once available in the world's finest libraries. Fantastical science fiction dreams have come true. Contrary to what visionaries of the future might previously have thought, this period of greater connection through technology seems not to have harmonized our thoughts and led to a new age of enlightenment and good feeling. Instead, we are distressed to find that people that we like reasonably well in the real world have such irritating political opinions in the virtual one. It's a bit like dreaming of how wonderful it would be to have the power of telepathy so that one could read the minds of others, and then gaining the ability only to be repulsed by what one learns. Why do we feel this way? I think a big part of the answer to that question has to do with the way we're constructed mentally. Our knowledge about the world is hard-won. Once we settle on an approach in our minds about something like politics, we don't want to continuously revisit and revise it. Instead, we want to settle on our principles and move forward. Imagine if something as fundamental as gravity had to be reconsidered each day, and that you weren't sure whether you would walk with confidence out your front door or float away. And yet, our approaches to living together seem to be almost that unstable at times. Consider the wholesale revision our society has undergone with regard to marriage or even gender. An understanding that appeared to be solid throughout millennia of human history turned out to be far less well established than anyone born more than 70 years ago would likely have believed. Or consider changes that have occurred in various places and times with regard to private property. If you lived in particular countries during the 20th century, you would suddenly have discovered that individuals could no longer own their own businesses or homes. Instead, the state asserted that ownership of all property was in the name of the people. People who understood things one way walked outside and found themselves parallel to the ground. Gravity shifted. Given my examples, perhaps you can understand why many of us pay so much attention to politics. We are invested in this dispute over the rules about how we're going to live together. And we understand that the stakes can be quite high. If you don't think so, ask someone who lives in Venezuela right now, where citizens are losing as much as 20 pounds a year due to a lack of food in possibly the most oil-rich country in the world. The laws of politics have their impact on human lives just as the laws of physics do. But we seem to have more control over the political laws. And if you think about it, that's actually a pretty terrifying temptation. Because we crave stability in our understanding of the world, we welcome confirmation of what we believe. I've experienced it personally. I used to go to a gym that always had MSNBC playing in front of the treadmill that I like to use. And it was irritating me because I'm more conservative, right? And about the time I would want to get on the treadmill, Ed Schultz would have a show that was on the air. And Ed's show was basically about the same thing every night. There were these demons breaking through the crust of the earth. And these demons, eventually, they were going to break through the crust of the earth and kill us all, and the demons were the Republicans, right? That was basically the show. And so because of my own ideological bent, I found this unpleasant, right? You know, I'd feel flushed, I felt irritated, I felt angry. And yet if I were to watch something different that was more agreeable to me, I would feel cool and calm, refreshed. I think that we're all that way. Now, in the old world of the three major networks, national magazines such as Time and Newsweek, and big city newspapers, the appeal of broadcast and publishing had to be necessarily broad. With the advent of cable and satellite television, 24-hour news networks, the internet, blogs, and social media, the entire landscape has changed. Instead of making a broad appeal, channels, publications, and websites have segmented into narrower and narrower offerings. The positive side is that one is not forced to submit to a sort of a monolithic, generally left-of-center news media, such as the one that dominated the previous era. But the negative side is that it's increasingly possible to gorge yourself on the confirmation of your own opinions and personal biases. One might almost imagine a hamster repetitively hitting a lever that disposes pellets. The nature of freedom is such that it opens the door to accompanying abuses. We can create self-constructed worlds in which wishing seems to make reality conform to desire. We need not throw away our precious liberty, but we must be aware of the pitfalls. Now, it's also important to reflect on the special nature of politics and government. In particular, we should ask one critical question. And I think that people don't dwell on this enough. What is it that makes government different from every other human activity? There is a difference. The answer is instructive. And I didn't create this definition. This is kind of a classic social science definition. Government is the institution in society that has a legal monopoly on the coercive use of violence. And that's okay. This violence is part of God's mandate for government. But we would do well to keep in mind that behind every act of government lies the gun, the prison cell, the trial, confiscation, possibly even execution. The use of this awesome social power must be weighed carefully. Because this threat is real, and because the stakes are so high, we must govern our passions in politics. To the extent that we allow our feelings about politics to resemble the ones we have about something relatively harmless like Big Ten or SEC football, we make a dangerous and unwise mistake. To the extent that our political leaders play along with that perilous dynamic, they betray our trust and lead us astray. No responsible person should encourage games with combustible material. Think about the Platonic soul and its hierarchy of the reason, the will, and the appetite. What are we aiming at with our politics? Are we aligning the functions of the soul properly, or are we distorting it through our attempts to manipulate public opinion in the same way Plato condemned the sophists for doing? So what is the answer? How can we overcome the disintegrating, tribalistic dynamics currently making our politics more divisive, more perilous, and less constructive? We need leadership that goes beyond this thing we call politics. What we need is statesmanship. Now, what is statesmanship? What is a statesman? And when I use that word, I mean it to be inclusive of men and women. The old joke is that a statesman is simply a politician who's been dead for a number of years. In other words, a statesman is a politician who has been out of sight and mind long enough that we mostly can't remember why many of us were so angry at him or her. But what is a statesman really? I'll attempt an answer. There is a particularly arresting passage written by the Roman proconsul Cicero in his book On the Commonwealth. Like many ancient texts, this one takes the form of a dialogue between friends. Cicero wrote the section I will describe in the voice of Scipio Africanus, a general and grandson of a great man by the same name. My translation titles this portion of the text, Scipio's Dream. But I have seen a centuries-old version that uses the evocative and beautiful language, the statesman's ecstasy. In this arresting vision, Scipio's consciousness travels to a location far beyond our planet into the cosmos. And it's here that he can experience the heavens in a way normally unavailable to human beings. He can see the earth and how small we are as part of the whole. The great general finds himself transported by the music of the heavenly spheres. Scipio learns that the work of the statesman is derivative of the work of God, who favors and blesses it. The task of the statesman is to cultivate justice and piety. He should be disposed to act for the good of everyone. The task is not an easy one. We have forgotten God. We cannot hear the music of the spheres as Scipio was able to in his dream. This is because we are like the people who live near a great waterfall. After enough time passes, they no longer hear its mighty roar. They have blocked it out. I would argue that in the crude nature of our politics, we manifest this metaphysical deafness. Perhaps that is the reason for our shouting and grotesque, exaggerated gestures. In a companion work on the laws, Cicero considered the bonds that unite human beings. We have been endowed by God with reason and judgment. The existence of our reason demonstrates the special bond we have with each other and with God. As the community that shares reason, we are all members of the same state. Indeed, we are a part of the same family fathered by God. Statesmanship is an appropriate response to the knowledge that we are created by God and that those of us in the human family share in this image. Cicero characterized the work of the statesman well when he wrote, I think it's a fabulous little section here. Among lyres and flutes or singing voices, a certain harmony must be maintained out of the different sounds. Trained ears cannot bear false or discordant notes. This harmony, full of concord and agreement, is produced from the regulation of the most dissimilar voices. In the same way, the city, having been regulated by reason, harmonizes through a consensus of the various elements from the upper, lower, and middle classes, just like musical notes. What musicians call harmony in music is concord in the city. The statesman, instead of the mere politician, isn't satisfied with the booms and bangs and crashes of power brought on by the reckless behavior of the demagogue in the political community. He disdains such selfishness, irresponsibility, and disregard for the whole. The work of the statesman is to figure out how to draw forth harmony and concord. Thus will the city be regulated by reason instead of by the manipulation and emotion fostered by the demagogue. Abraham Kuyper, probably known well to the people of this city, the former pastor, theologian, professor, newspaper editor, party founder, and prime minister of the Netherlands, serves as something of a model for my idea of the Christian statesman. He recognized that antagonism between classes was not something to be encouraged, but instead should be countered. He wanted to foster peace between the different groups in society instead of developing some evil identity politics. He emphasized the one-blood nature of human beings as they proceed from God's original creation. And Kuyper's efforts in education helped reconcile religious diversity and public unity. Plato wrote that philosophical statesmanship is more important than skill in oratory or war. It is about the wisdom of knowing how to decide what to do and when. It is the highest art that balances moderation and courage. I cannot help but recall the biblical reference to the men of Issachar in 1 Chronicles 12:32. It is written that these men understood the times and knew what Israel should do. There is a highly practical aspect of statesmanship that I would highlight as well. Thomas Aquinas wrote that the good practitioner of the law would recognize that it's unwise to attempt to overregulate behavior. The reason is not that we are morally indifferent to such things, but rather that if we apply law too harshly, then we risk creating a larger rebellion against it. It's important to be realistic about the possibilities and to be glad for opportunities to make incremental progress as opposed to bringing about sweeping revolutions. The statesman, in other words, doesn't overplay his hand. The statesman, then, is a person who governs for harmony and agreement, who fosters a politics of reason more than explosive emotion, who does not overreach, and who recognizes the fundamental dignity of persons under God. These thoughts are constant with the Christian faith, but I would like to delve a bit deeper to help us develop further insight. In particular, I'm impressed with what Augustine had to say about peace in the city of God. He began by observing that in our mortal lives, peace is the best thing to be had. It's simply good to live together in a harmonious way. But there's a problem for sinful human beings. In the same way that Aristotle noted, we're bad judges when it comes to ourselves, Augustine recognized that we're self-interested when it comes to the way we define peace. We all want peace, but on what terms? What we typically mean when we talk about peace is the peace we would impose on others. Pride, Augustine wrote, hates an equality with partners under God. It wants to impose its domination. This is a counterfeit peace, right? There's a peace to be had by dominating others. True peace between human beings is an ordered concord with a real sense of justice between the parties involved. Peace has to do with the tranquility that comes from having a just order. So when Martin Luther King Jr. emphasized that one cannot have peace or valid law without justice, he was likely referencing Augustine, whose work he knew. Slavery, domination, and disrespect come from sin. So how can we be just to one another? For the Christian statesman, this justice can emerge from the humility that we should have as sinful, self-oriented creatures who tend to view the world through their own preferred prisms. We tend to think in obvious terms about this justice. For example, we acknowledge the injustice inherent in major violations such as slavery or segregation. But I think that in our society, we're failing to do justice on more ordinary terms. Think about our politics. What are the major frames for our politics? Well, a lot of it is a sense of combat, right? There's a fight. Moral superiority, right? Thinking that my group is better than your group, morally superior to your group. And often a self-flattering belief in a monopoly on intelligence. These are increasingly kind of the frames for our politics and how we think of it. We think in terms of victory and defeat, heroes and villains, and blithering idiots and geniuses. Which is odd when you consider that we're all in this together, right? I mean, we are living in this same society together, and yet we're doing this. Peruse social media, and you'll frequently see references to how someone schooled someone else. They crushed or destroyed a pathetically weak opponent, and how science proves that conservatives or liberals are pathological in their mental imbalance. These approaches may entertain us, inflate our egos, and confirm our opinion that those who disagree with us are bad people. But do these ways of looking at politics do justice to those with whom we disagree? Are we humble enough about our own sinfulness and limitedness? Are we honoring the Imago Dei in our brothers and sisters in the human family, our fellow partakers in the gift of reason? Has our zeal for advocacy become divorced from important limiting principles of humility, mutual respect, and responsibility? Because of the way we think about politics, I would not be surprised if some members of the audience hear me and determine he is indicting Donald Trump, or he is attacking the liberal snowflakes. Neither of those conclusions are broad enough. What I'm really doing is leveling a critique against the entire political culture that we, and I include myself, I'm guilty, have developed. What does it look like for us to pursue this ideal of Christian statesmanship that I'm proposing? As Americans, we each contribute to the sovereignty of the United States government. We have a share of that Romans 13 power. That share is evidenced by our ability to vote, to participate in public service, to run for office, to assemble, to petition, to speak and write. Americans are not mere subjects of some throne, largely passive in the face of its government. Instead, we're citizens with the right to actively engage. I believe we should be accountable for how we employ that capacity in the same way we believe we are accountable to God for how we use our health, our strength, our gifts, our money. And while the great majority of us will not be in a position to function as captains of the state, we have a tremendous ability to help shape the political culture and the policies that proceed from it. That means we can encourage and relish political warfare, or we can put our interest and influence behind a more constructive approach that is more peaceful and which honors our fellow citizens and does justice by them instead of demonizing them and their beliefs. Perhaps the simplest way to think of the matter is in terms of developing a strong sense of philosophical charity. Our chances of relating well to each other and of having real conversations will be improved if we learn to see those who disagree with us as people who are also trying to pursue what is good. I think this is part of what James Davison Hunter meant in his book To Change the World when he encouraged Christians to pursue shalom. We need to try and reassure each other of our good faith, so we can renew our sense of what it means to be virtuous in the use of our freedom. The difference between liberty and license has to do with the way one uses freedom. License is freedom used irresponsibly. With a right use of our freedom, we can be citizen statesmen. Now, citizen statesmanship means informing yourself carefully about news and public policy, something that is increasingly difficult to do. Instead of relying on the sugar high of blustering talk show hosts and panels created to generate conflict, find reliable sources that strive to report as unemotionally and as informatively as possible. That sounds like a lot of work, and it is. And if you don't have time for it, then I would echo my friend John Mark Reynolds, who says, find somebody who is good at that and let their efforts be a ministry to you. But you're here today. So maybe you are the type of person who follows politics and pays a lot of attention and does take the effort to educate yourself. So maybe your citizen statesmanship can be a ministry to others. And this concept, this citizen statesmanship, means taking care in the way you express yourself with regard to politics. Don't link or share stories just because they affirm your point of view or make the other side look bad. Ask yourself whether we're engaging in accurate disagreement. Are we really clear on exactly what it is we disagree and why, right? I can tell you as a pro-lifer for decades that I've always been annoyed by those who say, I'm pro-life because I want to keep women barefoot in the kitchen. That's not why I'm pro-life. I'm pro-life because I believe that the unborn child is a human person who has rights and dignity. So let's be accurate about that disagreement, right? Make sure that when you're speaking or you share something that you're contributing ideas and information that are edifying. The alternative is simply to add to the pollution by throwing another piece of trash into the social media stream that generates anger and irrationality. Diplomatically hold friends and relatives to account in the same way you might do so with regard to other moral and spiritual matters. I mentioned earlier in the talk that I have spent time working with a group called Better Angels. Now, their typical strategy is to bring together equal numbers of red and blue voters, say 8 to 10 from each side, for several hours of discussion over 2 days. And before they begin, the interviews reveal the tendency of conservatives and liberals to condemn each other as people. The amazing thing that happens with the help of a facilitator who teaches both sides how to communicate in non-inflammatory ways is that they end the weekend thinking differently about the individuals on the other side of the table. A woman who said she could see no benefit in knowing conservatives who are probably racists admitted that she ended up liking the people that she met. A man who doubted any goodwill at all on the part of liberals expressed his new appreciation for them, even if he didn't agree with their views. It seems likely that the folks who have had this experience will at a minimum treat each other more fairly and be better at discussing politics in the future. Now, while they may not have the words to describe exactly what has happened, they have been reminded of their shared family heritage as image bearers. Maintaining these fundamental connections is part of how we avoid the major tragedies that can occur when we dehumanize others. It's important to recognize that this commitment to statesmanship doesn't mean that we just lay down our convictions. I hope that what I've said does not tell anybody that I want them to water down their beliefs or just fly to the middle of any particular public policy dispute. But rather, we need to engage in these practices of respect, arguing fairly and in good faith. And I think if we do so, we'll have a better chance at actually achieving some solutions. We also need to realize that, a lot of what I'm talking about relates to politicians, but there's a sense in which we get the politicians that we deserve, right? That if we teach the politicians, if we incentivize them, that what we want are these fireworks and this sort of bombastic nature, and that we want them to generate these emotional displays. I'm embarrassed by the emotional displays I see in the U.S. Senate. And yet these make very nice little 2-minute YouTube videos that can be shared around the internet. Apparently we're teaching the politicians that this is what we want, right? We need to teach them differently. So we need to tell our fellow citizens what we are for rather than emphasizing what we are against. But more specifically, we need to make it clear who we are for. We are for everyone. Even when we disagree, we're for everyone, and not just for the 50% plus one required to gain and hold power. Even when we disagree with you, we are for you. You are our brothers and sisters under the fatherhood of God and not demons to be cast out of society. I think I'll stop there. I know I'm a little bit over my time, so I will stop there. And I think we have Q&A, right? So I'd be happy to have any questions. Dan has a microphone. Yeah, thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for conversation over Q&A. So please raise your hand. Anna and I have the microphones, and we'll be able to get them to you. Please keep your questions clear and brief, and we will get to as many questions as possible. Thank you.
He looks like he's striving. There we go.
Okay, there we go. Never doubt. A Freed Hardeman grad. It's good to
Hey,
have Jackson folks
thank you.
in God's country. That's
Isn't
awesome.
it crazy that the weather is actually worse there right now than
I know,
it is
it is
here?
crazy. Glad
Yeah.
you made it up here.
Yeah.
When you look at our Constitution and kind of two different paths
Yeah.
that we definitely see formulated between a living Constitution and a realistic set Constitution.
Yeah.
How do we get to any kind of middle ground on, or even any kind of solution in that area?
Yeah. I'm so glad that you asked about the Constitution. We have, you're right, the living Constitution, we have stretched and pulled, and we have turned the Constitution into something totally other than what it was intended to be, right? Because, but if you look at our recent election, you still see some of that design, right? Okay, so, one of my students is here, so he's heard me say this a million times, but Cicero and others, they asked the question, is there any form of government that is stable, right? The monarchies, they're not stable, the aristocracies are not stable, the pure democracies are not stable. How do we get something that can stick, right, over time? And Cicero, who I quoted, he and others say we need the mixed constitution, right? We need to take the different forms and mix them, right? And so the U.S. Constitution, I think you can see, is actually designed to be a mixed constitution. And so here's how it is. The president is like the monarch. The Senate is like the aristocracy. And remember, they were originally not popularly elected. They were sent by state legislatures, right? And the House of Representatives is the democracy. And so you put these three together, right, in the government, and this is part of how that Federalist 10, you know, we set the different factions against each other. We have different elements demonstrated in different ways. We had our election, first Tuesday in November. Was everything up for grabs? No, right? The president was not on the ticket. So the president has the 4-year term. The House of Representatives has the 2-year term. The senators have the 6-year term. Only a third of the senators are ever up at any one time, right? So our founders understood the passions of democracy, right? And they wisely created a system where it's not all up for grabs. In the American system, it is never all up for grabs at the same time. And that is by design, right? That's a good thing, okay? Unless you were hoping for a revolution, then it's not, right? But they recognize this sort of nature, right? But so structurally, but also they had hopes. You know, we love to argue about the founders and who they were in terms of their religious belief. The reality is it's pretty mixed, right? You know, some of them are sort of evangelical Christians like we would recognize. Some of them are definitely not. Some of them are kind of in the middle. But I think that it was a general consensus, right, that they hoped that the Christian church would help to make people virtuous. That in order to be free, you need to be virtuous, right? And that's part of what I'm talking about here today. But yes, I mean, the Constitution, that sort of, when you have something like that where you have settled principles, helps to mitigate against the ferocity of passions and our attempt to do too much at one time, or maybe even to undermine our own principles. So yeah, you're right, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is a little bit about the circumstances. So I'm thinking of that proverb that says, do not answer a fool according to his folly. And that seems to be what you're emphasizing in your talk. But that proverb is immediately followed by the proverb that says, do answer a fool according to his folly. And so it seems that during the past, I don't know, few decades, Republicans, conservatives, Christians have erred on the side of we will not answer fools according to their folly. We will take the high road, and part of the attraction for Trump has been, oh, look, that guy fights, and I'm tired of being trampled all over. And yes, he might not be the most eloquent fighter, he might not be the most civil one, but at least he fights. Yeah. So, and obviously in political virtue, courage and thumos is part of that political virtue. So what place does thumos and spiritedness and fighting play in statesmanship?
Yeah, I figured that Donald Trump would come up one way or the other. And look, I mean, you know, back when George W. Bush was president, my general feeling was that he was horrible at defending himself and his own policies, that he was just sort of repeatedly getting punched in the mouth, and really was not able to effectively answer, right? And I thought to myself, boy, I'd like to have a president who was better at defending himself. And now I've gotten one who cannot ignore the slightest insult, no matter what, right? You know, I mean, you say, you know, anything negative to him, and he comes back with the atom bomb, right? But here's what I would say about Donald Trump. I think that Donald Trump, that while many people probably think that his bombastic nature benefits him, and maybe it does electorally, right? At least maybe it helped him get through that Republican primary, you know, and to get on the ballot, and then who knows what degree his victory was based on Hillary being on the other side of the ballot. I don't know. But that having been said, I think that he is underperforming his own results, right? I mean, public policy-wise. First of all, we rarely talk about Donald Trump's actual policy accomplishments, right? His administration has actually governed reasonably well, right? The economy, the unemployment rate is lower than I can remember it in my entire lifetime. I talked about how wages have been stagnant for a long, long time. People at the top have been doing better. People at the bottom staying the same. During just this last couple of years, wages have begun to increase for people at the bottom. That's a pretty significant achievement. We're not talking about that, right? Because he's fighting it out with Stormy Daniels or whatever, right? Horseface Daniels. The wages for African Americans have been going up. Wages for Hispanics have been going up. Before Donald Trump became president, a lot of people were saying that we have entered a period of permanent low growth. The economy cannot grow more than 1.5%, maybe 2%. We've seen it grow substantially more than that, right? So his policy results have been pretty darn good, and yet I don't feel like we were really talking about any of that stuff going into the election. So I think that his lack of statesmanship is actually hurting him in terms of what happened in the midterms, because I think that his record is better than his record is better, and we don't talk about it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I was running out. My question is how would you how would you help someone who believes that they are awake but are still sleeping, sleeping to the reality at how statesmanship has been distorted, the trueness of statesmanship has been distorted. Mm-hmm. How do you help them see the truth when they think their truth is the truth?
Yeah, this is a big challenge. I mean, I think a lot of this relates to who we are as people. People say that you get the government that you deserve. And it seems to me, I remember, gosh, a long time ago, I was teaching community college students when I was still a graduate student myself. And, it was tough to get these kids interested in government. It was really tough, right? And so one day in my frustration, I'm like, what would get you guys interested in government, right? And one of the kids said, make it like Saturday Night Live. Well, that's what it is now, right? I mean, we're living in kind of this constant Saturday Night Live government. The sketches are ready-made, right? That's part of what the challenge is, right? Is that the reason that I dwell on what government is, right? We don't think, the government is not like the Super United Way or the Super Red Cross or something like that. Government is something way more serious than that, okay? That's why I pointed out that government is ultimately the institution that will use violence, right? That is, how many people are in jail in this country? There are literally millions of people in jail. That's what government can do, right? Government has that decisive, final force, that coercive force. And to the extent that we're playing around with that, to the extent that we're using that for our own entertainment, is a terrible idea. And that's what I would say to people. I would say we need to realize how serious government is, and we need to stop playing games with it. That's what I would say. Yep, over there.
Thanks, Dr. Baker.
Thank you.
2 questions. First is for my personal enjoyment. How much of Ben Sass's book, Them, has influenced your talk and thinking?
I haven't read it at all.
Okay.
I haven't read it at all.
I haven't either.
Although, can I say this, Russell? He is not a bad candidate in the sense that he may have a vision for statesmanship. That he may, not necessarily in the ways that he's taken on Donald Trump, but in terms of that he tries to put forth a positive vision to seriously deal with cultural problems that we have in the United States, long-term cultural problems. I think that he shows some kind of statesman-like instincts.
Sure.
Yeah.
Second question is a little more abstract. You spend a lot of time talking about how Christian principles can breed a type of almost political pluralism that comes with tolerance and respect for everyone and differing ideas. And I certainly think that is a necessary remedy to the condition we're in. But I wonder, how much room is there in the Christian tradition for objective truth to policy questions in politics? And what would be the strategy for approaching those non-negotiables?
Yeah, first of all, when I'm talking about pluralism, right, there are places where you can be pluralistic and there are places where you cannot, right? We will never be pluralistic about murder, right? We'll never be pluralistic about theft, some of these sort of things. But when I think about the way John Locke and others argued for religious liberty, for instance, right, that it's hard to imagine Jesus Christ, forcing someone to kneel, right? When that happens, that will happen. Someday, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, right, that Jesus Christ is Lord. It won't be because you and I created the right piece of legislation to do it, right? It'll be because it's undeniable, God in all His glory, and that will happen, right? But recognizing this coercive nature of government that I've been talking about, it seems to me that we should avoid coercing people as much as possible. That unless we do that, if we apply the coercive touch too often, then we will run that risk, like Aquinas talks about, of causing people to reject authority, right? Causing people to lack respect for the law. So that's why I talk that way, right? And of course, our own recognition that we are sinful, right? And so that's why I don't want to be too sure about when I force somebody else to do something, right? That I have to acknowledge, yes, this could be kind of a correct conclusion from my faith, but it could also be me trying to just assert my will, right? Something like that. But that having been said, Russell, by the way, is my student from undergrad. He's now a PhD student at Hillsdale. But this is the great discussion that we had all through your time at Union, right? That it's always kind of coming down to that question of freedom versus kind of a vision of the good and what it takes to fulfill a vision of the good, right? And my tendency has always been to gamble on freedom, and your tendency has been to gamble on the vision of the good, right? And that's kind of where we are. Yeah. All right. Yes, sir.
All right, yeah, thank you for your talk, by the way. I
Thank
just
you.
want to ask the question about how statesmanship might come into play, because I know that you spoke about how we should refrain from trying to, I guess I don't know how to put the word for it, like just purposefully hurt the other side,
Yeah.
just based on our beliefs and how we want to lift ourselves up. How does statesmanship come into play when we fear to offend someone else on the other side? For example, like based on their political or personal beliefs. I guess we talked about that in class.
Yeah.
Where we tackled about the idea about being able to pick your own gender, to choose your own gender.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how we saw college students fearing to admit that someone
like
might
the
be
young
wrong.
lady at Berkeley. I think it was Berkeley. That's the recent story. Young lady at Berkeley. They were voting on some big transgender thing in the student senate. She didn't even vote against it. She abstained, right? She abstained, and then she explained that her Christian faith prevented her from embracing the legislative item, right? And now everybody's trying to kick her off the Senate and, humiliate her and everything else. I think the answer has a lot to do with sort of the Aristotelian golden mean, right? Yes, on the one hand, you can make yourself obnoxious and you can harass people and attack people and criticize them in bad faith, not deal with their true objection, but deal with the objection that you wish they had. So you can do that, and that's all wrong. But the other thing that's wrong is to stand for nothing and just totally accommodate yourself to the culture, right? And that's, yeah, I mean, look, so I'm talking about kind of the one thing, but you're exactly right to bring up the other thing. Sometimes what's needed in statesmanship is courage. And sometimes we lack that. I mean, in my world of Christian colleges and universities, there are a lot of people who are scared of the direction the culture is going, and their answer is not to stand up, but just capitulate, just give up, right? And that's wrong too. We need to try to find that right zone in the middle, right, where we're honoring the truth and we're being respectful of people. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Is there any country in the world that you think does what you're talking about well right now or in history?
It's a really good question. Here's what I would say to that. I think it's a human problem, right? But there are structures that could be designed differently. So, for example, in the U.S., we have a system of elections where we have primary elections in a party, and then we have a general election, right? The primary election tends to be about who are the most enthusiastic, the people most forcefully expressing themselves kind of within a party, the people who are the most activist. And a lot of times that can produce, or at least that's the case now, it is producing increasingly candidates who are tilted to one side or the other, right? So if we were to look at the United States back in the 70s, okay, and if we were to look at the ideological makeup of the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, and everybody was graded from 0 to 100 based on their adherence to one side or the other, we would see that there would be some folks kind of out on either end, but most of them would be kind of clustered toward the middle. And you see lots of bipartisan legislation, you know. Most of the major legislation in U.S. history was bipartisan in nature, like the GI Bill, for example, you know, or something like that. But now, partly because of the technology and culture change, we don't see that group kind of clustered in the middle anymore. Increasingly, all the members of Congress, all the people in the U.S. Senate are increasingly out on those edges, right? And they know, I suspect that they know that if they try to do things in a bipartisan way, if they try to work with the other side, they'll simply be viewed as a sellout and punished in the next primary, right? A primary opponent will be found. My suspicion is that our way of doing elections, you know, sort of the binary, it's one party or the other, there's no room for third parties, there's no room for, you know, kind of other points of view, plus that primary system is giving us an increasingly polarized system. And I wish we could address that in some way.
Thank you, Dr. Baker.
Thank you.